look back at the events of David's life, I didn't find that he caused the problem. In fact, what I found is the whole problem started with Saul. Started with Samuel. And what happened is first recorded in 1 Samuel 8, 4, and 5. You don't need to turn to it because I'll try and read these. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel in Ramah and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. That was the thing. 1 Samuel 8, 6, and 7 continues, but the thing displeased Paul when they said, Give us a king to judge us, because Samuel was the judge over all. He was old, he knew he had to have a replacement, but why a king? Samuel prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto the voices of the people in all they have said unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them again. The next event I found was recorded in 1 Samuel 11:15 through 12:1, but it's summarized later in 1 Samuel 15:1. It reads, Samuel came to Saul and said, The Lord sent me to anoint thee king over his people, over Israel. The Lord's test of the new king, Saul, was recorded in 1 Samuel 15:3, just 2 verses later. And the command was, Now go smite Amalek and utterly destroy all they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, sheep and ox and sheep, camel and ass. But Saul didn't obey. A few verses later in 1 Samuel 15:9, it's recorded, But Saul and his people spared Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites at the time. But Saul and his people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good. The next 2 verses read, Then came the word of the Lord to Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel that he had, and he cried all night to the Lord. This was not at all what Samuel thought was going to happen. When Samuel confronts Saul, Saul first says he performed the commandment of the Lord, and then he blames the people under his command for having taken all these things. And finally, Saul asks Samuel to pardon his sin. In Samuel 1st 15:26, Samuel responds to what Saul had said. And this was a big thing. I will not return to thee with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected thee from being king over Israel. So the first test, Saul fails. Samuel's statement to Saul appears to me to have been a private one-on-one conversation. There's no public de-anointing of this king. So in the eyes of the world, Saul continues to be the king of Israel. In the next few verses, Samuel cleans up the mess that Saul had created and then departs. But Samuel continues to mourn Saul. And I know you're all sitting there thinking, that's nice, but what's this got to do with David? Well, it's all before David. But right in the next verse of 1 Samuel 16:1 is where it all comes together and becomes David's problem. It really wasn't David that caused the problem. The Lord had set this up. And 1 Samuel 16:1 reads, And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. A few verses later, Samuel was looking upon the 7 sons of Jesse, the first 7 sons, and the Lord told Samuel that he had looked upon their hearts and had not chosen any of these, but instead chose David, the youngest, who was out tending the sheep. A few verses later in Samuel 16:13, 2 things happened to David. And it reads, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. Thus David knew, as a youth, that God's plan would take him from being a lowly shepherd to lonely shepherd tending his father's sheep, all the way to the top, to be king of Israel. David also knew that Saul was already anointed the king. And so the test for David began with having to trust and wait on the Lord, for the Lord to make a way for him to become the king. And so that's the beginning of all of David's problems. And I think importantly also is because Samuel anointed David king in front of his brethren, the words of David's anointing did not spread far. It was not common knowledge. And so what that means to me is Saul did not know. In 1 Samuel 16:15, it continues with the insight. In the next 3 verses, the Lord starts the ball really rolling on this. In 1 Samuel 16:14 says, But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and the evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. The evil spirit from the Lord. So you know something's going to happen. And 1 Samuel 16:50 continues with the insight. And Saul's servant said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. So everybody was seeing it, and everybody was ascribing this to God. Notice that Saul's servants also made a recommendation to Saul that music would help. They specifically recommended David, and they concluded their recommendation with, The Lord is with him. They were right. By the end of the chapter, Saul had called David, David had played for him, and the evil spirit of the Lord left Saul. In 1 Samuel 17, Matthew, last week, described several things that will impact David. The Philistines gathered for battle. Saul and his men set up for battle. David went home to tend his sheep. His 3 oldest brothers followed Saul to battle. And importantly, the Philistine champion, Goliath, appears. And he calls out Israel day and night for 40 days. Meanwhile, back home, David is still tending his father's sheep. It's probably been more than a month since his brothers left for the battle. And so David's father, Jesse, sends David with a cart of food for his brothers. In a straight line, that journey is about 15 miles, but the road today is 29 miles. So it was no small thing to make that kind of a journey. Now, all of this so far was God setting things up. David hadn't done anything. Nothing in his life up to this point can you really point at saying he caused the problem. But when David arrived to his brothers, he was there in time to hear Goliath call out Israel again. And he could see the fear in the Israelites' army's eyes. And he heard the gossip among the men about the riches that Saul would give to whoever killed Goliath. But David grows indignant. That's what the Bible talks about. He isn't looking at the rewards. He's growing indignant at this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the army of the living God. Well, David is hearing the gossip from another group of the soldiers in the camp. His brother falsely accuses him of having abandoned his duties at home and come not knowing that it was his father that sent him. David turns around and hears a third group, again with the same gossip. And I can just imagine he is growing more indignant every time he hears it. Well, his words are noticed, his attitude is noticed. He's reported to Saul and shortly finds himself standing in front of Saul. That's when David takes the first real action that led to a lot of his problems or a lot of events in his life. At that point, the Bible records that David volunteered to fight Goliath. Saul said, "No, you're just a youth. You're not a fighting man like Goliath. You aren't trained. You can't do it." But David responded by telling Saul how he had tended his father's sheep. And while he was doing that, he had slain a lion and a bear. In 1 Psalm 17:37, David said, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of that lion, out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." When David gave credit to the Lord, Saul said, "Go, let the Lord be with thee." Last week, again, our Matthew, had covered the fight between David and Goliath. And what we all know is the Lord made it short and very impactful. So after Goliath, the Lord continued to set up things that would influence David's future. Some would be magnifying problems, some would be blessings in times of trouble. David was brought before Saul after he killed Goliath, and Saul asked who he was, whose son he was. And it's always made me wonder, David had played the harp for him and helped the evil spirit of God depart from him, but Saul didn't seem to recognize it. And then I think, well, Saul had a lot on his mind with his battle and all these men and all the things, trying to figure out who he could get for a champion, all these things. So I can see it both ways, but it is interesting to me that he didn't recognize him. Saul took this, a second thing that was very important is Saul took David at that time and didn't let him go home. "You belong to me. I'm going to keep you close." 1 Samuel 18:1 says about David, "And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan," Jonathan was Saul's son, "the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Jonathan and David made a covenant, and Jonathan gave David his robe, his garments, his sword, and his girdle. And then Saul, the Bible records, placed David over his army, and he was accepted by all." But it was at the victory celebrations that followed that everything went wrong. The women were praising Saul for slaying his thousands, and for David his tens thousands. The 1 Samuel 18:9 through 10 records, "And Saul eyed David from that day forward. The next day the evil spirit of the Lord was back upon Saul." I think that Saul knew that the Lord was with David, but I don't think Saul knew yet that the Lord had already anointed David to be king. Psalm 18:12 records that Saul was afraid of David, and because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. You see the jealousy and bitterness starting. Although David behaved himself wisely and the Lord was with him, Saul was afraid of David and became his enemy continually. We remember twice Saul cast a javelin at David to kill him. Saul set up an opportunity for the Philistines to kill him. And ultimately, this is the one I didn't remember. In 1 Samuel 19:1, Saul tells Jonathan and his servants to kill David. But Jonathan talked to Saul on David's behalf, and Saul relented and he swore, "As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain." Sounds good? Do you believe him? Bitterness will take you where you don't want to go. Well, then the war returned, and David slew the Philistines with a great slaughter. He was a faithful servant and a great warrior. But the evil spirit of the Lord was upon Saul, and he again tried to kill David with a javelin. Saul sent men to David's house to kill him, but David escaped out a window and fled. He fled to Samuel. David told Samuel everything that Saul had done to him, and together they went to Ramah. Saul found out where David was and sent men to go there to take him. But God stepped in at that time. When those men that Saul sent to take David got there, the Spirit of the Lord came upon the men, and they prophesied. When Saul heard that, he wasn't happy, but he sent a second group of men to go take Saul. And again, when they got there, they prophesied because the Lord was on them. So Saul, even more angry, sends a third group to go take David for Saul. And they also prophesied. Finally, Saul went himself. The end of 1 Samuel 19 records that the Spirit of God came upon Saul, and he too prophesied. Can't beat the Lord. 1 Samuel 20 starts with David fleeing to Jonathan from that, asking, "What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father, that he seeketh my life?" David couldn't tell what he had done wrong. In fact, he had done nothing wrong. It was the Lord. And so what we see is that Jonathan is a blessing. For the rest of chapter 20, Jonathan and David conspire, which is the right way to describe it, conspire to test Saul to see if he still wants to take David's life. And in a word, the answer is yes. So David fled to Nob and to the priest Ahimelech. When he was questioned by Ahimelech, David lied to get food and a weapon. The priest said, "The only sword here is the sword of Goliath, who you slay." They had nothing else. And as soon as David got the food and got the sword, he fled. This is where David was crossing over. And in 2 more chapters in the Bible, we'll find out it's going to be very costly for Elimelech too, because Elimelech although he was innocent, he will be killed by Saul for helping David. Also, Elimelech's 84 priests were killed by Saul, and all the men and women and children and sucklings of Nob, the city there, were killed, as well as all the oxen and all the asses and all the sheep. Saul just went nuts in his bitterness. Saul's actions and thoughts show us 2 Bible lessons. That bitterness will take you further than you want to go, and that undealt with sin will harden your heart. But back to David. That same day, he got the sword, and the food. He fled to Achish, the king of Gath, a Philistine. And 1 Samuel 21:11 tells us that was a mistake. The servants of Achish said unto him, meaning to the king, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? This is another place where I think God stepped in and took over part of David's life. The servants had correctly identified David, and they told the king right there. And as they were telling him, David realizes what a terrible mistake he had made, and he feigns madness, craziness. And I think God stepped in so that the eyes of the king only saw the crazy man. They didn't see David. And he allowed David to depart. In 1 Samuel 22, David escapes to the cave of Adullam, and his family joins him there, and everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontent gathered there to David. And he became the captain over all of them, and with him there were about 400 men. Among the things I find interesting, having been to Israel and looked out in the wilderness, how did his family know where he was? They didn't have a cell phone to call him. God had to be working behind the scenes, and we'll see that happens many more times. But in reading about that cave, it was a place that over time many people knew about and sought refuge there. So that I can understand the locals, but his family, I don't know. But soon it was time to move on from that cave because Saul heard that's where he was, and he came hunting him. And this was the time in that hunt for David that Saul killed Amalek, the priest of the living God, his 48 priests, and all those who were living in Nob. So I just wanted to show that there was a point where David had started crossing over, and this consequence wouldn't be for a little while, and it would be, I don't know how many hundreds of people were slain. But David started turning to the Lord, asking for guidance, and he kept moving. David was living the biblical truth that there are times when we are totally dependent on the Lord, and there's nothing man can do. Then when David was in the wilderness of Ziph, in the woods, notable things happened. 1 Samuel 23:16-17 tells us, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the wood. Saul, his father, couldn't find him. How was Jonathan able to go to him? It had to be the Lord. But it continues with Jonathan, Saul's son, went to David in the wood and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul, my father, shall not find thee. That's a nice thing to say, but how do you know it's true? And thou shalt be king over Israel. Well, God told me that. Yeah, okay. And I shall be next to you. Sounds good. And then he says something that I didn't really remember. He says, and that also my father knoweth. Now, did Saul know that Jonathan and David were bound together? Or did he know that David was going to be king of Israel? Well, I believe now that really says that Saul at that time had finally come to know that David was anointed and would become king of Israel. So God's plan for David in this dark and troubling time included that Jonathan would find him in the wilderness, that Saul couldn't, and that Saul knew David would be king. So now the bitterness, I'm sure, was just really frothing as Saul looks as a king. Everybody's out to get me. And he who is closest to me, who is better than me, who I know is going to be king, I got to get rid of him if I'm going to stick around as king. And what we see in man through history is that desire to retain the power, not to do the will of God. And he knew that David was anointed, and that was the will of God. Well, even using informants and sending out spies wouldn't be enough before God stepped in again. Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men when a messenger came to Saul and said, "The Philistines are invading the land." So Saul immediately left hunting down David to go fight off the Philistines. But as soon as that was over, Saul was back on the hunt for David with 3,000 chosen men. 1 Samuel 24 tells a great deal of how 1 Samuel 24 tells in great detail how God set up the test of David by bringing Saul to within a blade's length of David's knife. David easily could have killed him and become king. Ended his persecution, everything would have come up roses. Instead, David cut off a piece of Saul's robe. 1 Samuel 24 talks about David and his motivations. And he said unto his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." I don't know how many people would have really thought that way. It's a severe temptation for probably everybody. But as Saul departed the area, David came out after him, testifying to all that had just transpired, and as proof of what David said, he waved the piece of the robe. And Saul wept, and Saul acknowledged that the Lord had delivered him up to David to be killed. But David didn't kill him. And Saul publicly admitted that David would be king of Israel. And he asked David to swear that he wouldn't kill Saul's family. That was the normal thing to do. You kill all the family. That's the end of the line. That's how you handle your enemies. And David swore, and Saul left, but David went the other way. So it was a smooth sailing for David. After all, David had passed the great test that God had given him. In a word, no. David would have the same test again in the next chapter, but this time with a churlish and evil man, Nabal. In that test, David was talked out of seeking revenge by Nabal's wife, Abigail, who also said the Lord would appoint David to be ruler over Israel. So now was it smooth sailing for David? He had passed the test with the great enemy and the small. In a word, no. David would have the same test again in the next chapter, only this time it was with his mighty men. In 1 Samuel 26, 1:1, we learn that Saul got a tip on David's whereabouts, and he arose again with 3,000 chosen men to go catch David. Now this is the same Saul who swore to Jonathan that he would not be slain, who had tried several times to kill or have him be killed, who had admitted that the Lord had brought Saul up to David's knife to kill him, and Saul wasn't killed by David. And now he's back after him again. Well, in this test, which is recorded in 1 Samuel 26:1-1, Saul and those 3,000 men were out, and they got very close to David. Saul's camp, noun, camped, the verb, and the sleep of the Lord came upon them. David saw that he was there. He was very close. He could see exactly where Saul was. And he and Abishai snuck down into the camp, and the test came. Saul's spear was right there. Saul was right there. And David wasn't tempted this time, but Abishai was. And David had to say, "Destroy him not, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" Well, make a long story short, they took Saul's spear and his cup of water and got away without being seen or heard by anybody. And then from the top of a hill nearby, David calls out to Saul. Saul answers and ultimately admits, again, he has sinned and never again will try to harm David. Saul blesses David and then goes home. But David had learned that he couldn't trust Saul. He could forgive him, but he couldn't trust him. So based on all that had happened, David decided to take his men, his 600 men with him, and go where Saul would never go, into the land of the Philistines. This time, Achish, the Philistine king, knows it's David. And he's heard of the things that have been going on, that Saul was after trying to kill David. And so he welcomes David and he gives him Ziklag as a city to live in, with he and all his men. And he has David smite some old enemies. And that proves David is loyal to him. And it was so effective that Achish believed that David would be his servant forever. But God knew it was going to only be 16 months. By that time, the end of 16 months, the Philistines and the Israelites were again preparing for war. But the king, Achish, trusts David and his men to go to war with him on the side of the Philistines. And as all the armies assemble, suddenly the Philistines recognize David. And they say, "Oh no, he isn't coming with us. In the confusion of battle, he will probably turn his sword on us and let the Israelites win." And so it was a lot of protesting, and finally Achish sends David and his men back to Ziklag. David doesn't have to fight Israel. That's a God thing, I think. But meanwhile, as that little piece is going on, something else was going on. And it's probably what happens a lot when two kings in that volatile land took their armies off to war. The other kingdoms and peoples would attack when the armies were gone. And so when David and his men got back to Ziklag, he found that the Amalekites had attacked and burned the city, had taken everyone and everything out of it. And to say it quite simply, it was a really, really bad time for David, a real low time. But David sought the guidance of the Lord, and the Lord told him he would prevail. And so, cutting the story short, the fact is that David did prevail. He and his men, only 400 of his men, were able to not only rescue all of the people from Ziklag, all the wives, children, and everyone, but they were able to recover all that had been taken from them. And in addition to that was the spoil that the Amalekites had taken from the land of the Philistines and the land of Judah. David wisely restored to his city that which was theirs, and the other spoils that he got, he distributed elsewhere in Israel. And so, meanwhile, back at the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, which was just a few minutes ago in this, things didn't go well for Saul. It didn't go well at all. Saul and his brother and his sons were slain, and when the men of Israel saw that, they fled, and that concludes the book of 1 Samuel. But there's more to come. There's a second book. And in second book, first chapter, verses 1 through 9, we find that when David hears of Saul's death, he mourns him. He respects the family. And he still, in death, says, this was the anointed of God. He understands that everything he has gone through was much bigger than himself, that there's more to come. He had been promised to be the king of Israel, and he wasn't anything yet. But the next chapter, 2 Samuel 2:4, David he's crowned the king of Hebron, so he is a king, but he understands there's a lot more to come. Some of it's going to be good, some of it won't be. And it all did come. By 2 Samuel 5, verse 1 through 5, David is at the age of 30. He was anointed king over Hebron. And although he was told as a youth, he still had to trust and wait on the Lord to become king of Israel. At this point, he doesn't know it. He isn't even halfway through his life. But the Lord certainly is not through with growing and testing David. We'll see in the future that after 7 more years of strife, David will be anointed king of Israel, and he'll rule for 33 years. He'll humbly stand in awe of what the Lord has done, acknowledging all the victories were the Lord's. And he will praise the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord was on David from his youth. David was wise in his behavior. He knew that the Lord was powerful enough to make all this happen. But sometimes he had acted without going to the Lord first for direction. David knew from his anointing that God had a plan for him and what that plan was. But I think David had the faith, kind of like Abraham had, knowing the end, but not what lay between. But he trusted on the Lord would make it that way. So that's the lesson for today. So let's conclude in prayer. Heavenly Father, after seeing all that David went through, I pray that each and every one of us will not become a why me, Lord, Christian. Especially in the face of the adversity and persecution and spiritual battles we will face in our lives. That we will face them all because we know our end. Romans 8 tells us that we who believe are the adopted children of God. And because 1 John 4:4 says, greater is he that is in you than he who is in the world. Let each of us be an overcomer. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.